Hi, this is Michael Gordon coming to you live from the beautiful Sunshine Coast in the west coast of Canada, British Columbia. It's a beautiful sunny day. You can see behind me is the Salish Sea, otherwise known as the Georgia Strait, out to the Juan de Fuca Strait and our American friends on the other side of the border. And I'm coming to you live today with some thoughts about current events and some philosophical considerations given the kind of discourse that's out there and the controversy around, particularly around Jordan Peterson and his remarks about what's happening in terms of the breakdown of the social order and, identity politics and, all these kind of issues that he's raising that seem to get a lot of traction. A little bit about myself first. I am a doctoral candidate at Simon Fraser University here in beautiful British Columbia, and my area of research is in practice. And practice, in my case, overlaps a couple of areas. One of them being teaching, and that is as a Aikido teacher, which I've been doing for many years. And secondly, as an educator, and my doctorate is in philosophy of education. So I am a adjunct faculty or a sessional instructor at Simon Fraser University, and also I'm a psychotherapist, so psychoeducation is a big part of what I do. And that means informing people about some of the dynamics that inform us as human beings and that are implicated in making change, and how to be more proactive about being our better selves. And it's really on that last point that I'm recording this video today. There seems to be sort of this heightened energy and attention around, almost like a frantic energy that's been there for many years in the personal development field around being your best self. And of course, the apex of that food chain would probably be Tony Robbins, although you could say he's been knocked off his pedestal recently in the science of human development or personal development by Jordan Peterson, who is more of a public intellectual than he is sort of a coach, although he's sort of slipped into that role. But this kind of preoccupation with the self, I think, is misguided in the sense that it is a preoccupation that is about the self only, not vis-a-vis the impact on others. And so there is a focus on how to be your better self and to remove blocks and in kind of an Abraham Maslow kind of humanistic psychological perspective to, if you know Maslow's pyramid of needs, you have your sort of the baseline, which is sort of your basic needs, getting your material needs met, and then your emotional needs, and then so forth up until what he calls self-realization, or self-actualization. And so that's important, to optimize who we are and our sense of being able to have a purpose and to feel that we are engaged in life. It's really important to remove those limitations and of course any real threats or inhibitors to our mental, emotional, and physical well-being. And so Peterson is picking up on I think what he sees as sort of like the hyper stratification of what he calls communalism, in the sense that identity politics says there are oppressed groups of individuals in society and that they're a cry against institutionalized discrimination. So writ large on the social sphere, you see these blocks or institutionalized barriers to our progress as individuals. And so it's a classic debate. And of course Peterson's raising these issues in terms of historically and in sort of a liberal argument that the striving of the individual is really what is paramount, because each individual has their own inherent identity and needs and drives, etc., etc. Well, that is true, and that is important psychologically speaking, and certainly socially speaking, that we all want to strive to be who we authentically are. But I want to raise the point here that to do that in kind of a vacuum is part of what I see as the breakdown of social order. And I want to raise, sort of two key thinkers here that would help frame this a little bit more in a more socially responsible and I think realistic way. One of them is the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, who talks about in his book The Ethics of Authenticity, what do we do if the threat is we have no identity and we slip into this sort of threat of communalism, as Peterson warns us, that cultural Marxism, as he calls it, this sort of enforced communality that everyone has to sort of abide by agreed principles. Or the other end of the extreme is you're so solipsistic and so narcissistic, and it's all about you and your individual path in life, that you have no regard for anybody else. And so in this book, Charles Taylor is trying to rescue this middle ground and this mission of authenticity, because it is a human need to feel that we are speaking authentically and acting authentically according to what our needs are. And so Taylor makes this argument for what he calls a horizon of significance, that it's neither only for ourselves or not for ourselves. And this invokes the famous Hillel's famous prayer in Talmudic Judaism, which is if not for me, then whom? If only for me, then what purpose? And if not now, when? So to find that middle ground, to say, yes, it's important to strive for who we really are, but that's measured against this horizon of significance. The other key thinker I want to bring in here very briefly is the Buddhist monk who's French by nationality, named Mathieu Ricard. And Mathieu Ricard is the French interpreter to the Dalai Lama, and he became an ordained monk in that tradition, in Tibetan Buddhism, many years ago, when he grew very dissatisfied and disheartened by this sort of high French intellectual culture that he grew up in, and this striving for intellectual kind of status and accomplishment to him didn't really pay off in terms of happiness. So one of his previous books is called Happiness, and he measures happiness by the kind of compassionate abiding of our own experience and suffering in kind of a friendly-like way, working with our own mind. That's a very Buddhist kind of orientation. Not, again, in sort of the acquisitional view of striving for material things in life or accomplishments or achievements, but just by a sense of being there non-judgmentally for ourselves. His most recent book, though, is called Altruism, and so he's tapping into all kinds of social and sociological, zoological, very transdisciplinary research about what's called pro-social behavior. And so, many years ago there was a book called The Selfish Gene, which says essentially we all strive to, survive, and that's true. All life forms strive for growth and to fight against death and decay and threat. But pro-social behavior is pointing to behavior that's not necessarily to individual advantage, and certainly not altruistic in the sense of an ethical, moral framework, but just what benefits all, the group. And so this has been seen experimentally and also in the wild with primates and other animals, where they will work together for mutual reward and benefit. And so Mathieu Ricard is sort of trying to get us to understand that to think of altruism not as this highfalutin spiritual or ethical goal that's, maybe in Peterson's eyes is naive and kind of cross purposes to focusing on our individual path in life. So maybe the triangulation here in those two thinkers is to come back to some of the ancient Greek philosophy. And certainly Peterson's talking about Stoicism a lot in his work. But one of the thinkers that he criticizes heavily, and I think he not only myself, but many other people would say he categorically denies and wholesale throws out as part of the package of postmodernism, as he calls it, and the sort of cultural Marxism is his buzzword, is Michel Foucault. And one of the things that Foucault did at the end of his life as a famous French philosopher was to come back to this Aristotelian notion or Socratic notion of looking at ourselves as the path to greater social good. In other words, if you have a society that is based on people who are fulfilling their authentic selves, what's called the care of the self, again, against this horizon of significance of a collection or a community of individuals who are all looking at their own ethical regard and behavior and the consequences of the behavior on others. So I wouldn't say that Peterson is against that purpose, not by any stretch. I think he's reaching to find a way that we can all look inward to be the best human beings we can. And I appreciate that in his work and why a lot of people are attracted to his work. Where I think it goes very badly is that is somehow measured against the efforts to identify institutional oppression, power, essentially. And this is greatly what Foucault's work was about, was situating power historically, and specifically in terms of what he called sovereign power, state power, and how we internalize this. And so in my work as a therapist and also prominently as an Aikido teacher, I'm looking about this practice of dialogue and relationship. And so my focus is always on how does our behavior impact others, and how does our internal life and any distortions that we may be carrying about who we are vis-a-vis others that we may have picked up in our own development, child development, and maybe those are connected to attachment wounds or issues that we have in our upbringing, which is our ability to tolerate separateness and difference and otherness. And this is certainly a theme that Peterson is bringing up in his invocation of Carl Jung, because Jung talked a lot about individuation and differentiation. But we have to remember that this all occurs in relationship, not outside relationship, ever. We are relational beings inherently. And this is proven true, in fact, by empirical research on and into attachment, infant attachment, and the idea that somehow that we can learn to self-regulate, and as therapists that we would help people learn how to self-regulate. Meditation taught in schools will help students self-regulate in a classroom that may be overcrowded, or when there are social issues or behavioral issues in the classroom. So self-regulation is, as the American psychotherapist Bonnie Badenoch says, is a myth in a sense. It's co-regulation. A mother's feeling calm and feeling an oxytocin release or an endorphin release in the attachment with the child. And this is an ongoing process. And as Badenoch says, even in our psychotherapeutic, in our therapeutic alliance and relationship in practice, there is a mutuality to the space between the client and the therapist. There is a kind of a new attachment that forms, a healing attachment. And so my work is looking at all these angles on relationship and ethics and the study of the self. And there are other models, notably Martin Buber, who talks about the I-thou relationship, that the relationship is inclusive of each of us, and that can go beyond the dyadic into the triadic and so forth, into group relationship. But it is always based on this consideration of the impact on others. So there are many different ways that I'm sure Peterson would take that argument apart and say that his concern is not antithetical to consequence, but quite on the contrary. But I think that there is something quite problematic in stigmatizing and in labeling and wholesale dismissive approach to analysis of power and historical power and institutional power against victimized groups, particularly women, gays, lesbians, and transsexuals, and so forth. And so, his real screed and kind of obsession, even to the point of taking action and seeking to root out ethnic studies and women's studies and race studies programs as this kind of campaign against cultural post-Marxist modernism, as he calls it, to me seems really overreactive and just epistemologically wrong, given the kind of things that I'm talking about in terms of how we take in experience and form knowledge and shape meaning of our world. So lastly, I'll just leave you on some thoughts about what Aikido is. And people look at Aikido, which is a Japanese-based martial art. It's not really a martial art in the sense of martial skill and fighting, but more about, again, relationship of self within community, within a cosmos. And this East Asian view is one that is what you call holistic. It's based on an idea of monism, that there is one existence, or what's also called non-dualism. And so this has profound implications, not just spiritually, of course, but also socially and culturally and politically. because you consider everyone to be part of the same family. That was the mission of the founder of Aikido. So the practice of Aikido is not to learn how to defend yourself against attackers or antagonists in the sense that you hold anyone else as a potential attacker. That's of course important from a martial point of view to defend yourself. But rather it's quite the opposite. This is what makes Aikido such a sophisticated art. It's cultivating oneself internally in the sense of our emotional life and any distortions again that we carry, and certainly with a Buddhist influence, that includes the way that we view the world as being self and other, inside, outside, these dualistic terms. Sets up, a kind of an antagonism, and there's lots of great literature out there, Buddhist and otherwise, that talks about the problem of perception. Merleau-Ponty, another French philosopher, explored this in great depth, and on and on and on. But the Buddhist point of view is essentially that this idea that the ego is an actual solid structure, and that our identity is contained somehow in this, is unworkable. Because it's not real. Consciousness is something that is, again, relatively arranged around the whole, around a relationship to experience. And so Aikido kind of takes that in at the ground level and says, how do we work with that? When we see someone who's trying to disrupt or attack or displace us or even kill us, rather than regard them as, from the point of view as I was ready for this, here comes this outsider, here comes this not me, who has come here to threaten me, to see it as a disturbance to balance on the whole. And that means to work on oneself to be calm and to be centered and to be non-reactive, and to then mirror that in what I call our outer posture. So there's the inner posture of calmness and centeredness, and then that is twinned by the outer posture and the movements of Aikido, which are to time and blend as non-destructively as possible to contain and control the situation. So it's both a practical skill and a metaphor for how to approach conflict and dialogue. That's a lot. Kind of just spinning that out off the top of my head, and of course having written my thesis and being prepared to defend it, and feeling very strongly about this upsurge, this emotional button that Peterson has seemed to hit, and how it resonates with people, and wanting to kind of get at it in a different way to get people to think about these things that are partial truths in what he's saying, but in terms of more consideration for the broader whole, and not such a reactive stance against how Peterson is, I think, mislabeling these philosophical cultural traditions as in a kind of demagogic kind of way, and rather to see that they speak to real inequality and oppression, and how we need to factor that into our own self-development and cultivation, and our behavior and our ethics. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed this little spontaneous talk and the beautiful view of the west coast of British Columbia. This is Michael Gordon, otherwise known as the Mind Whisperer online, and tune in for more conversations as things go along, and when my book comes out in the next year, you'll find much more of this kind of conversation and exploration of these topics. Till then, see you next time.